Pharisees have become a stereotype of legalism, and of legalism that is hypocritical. So there is a drink that was at one time available in, I think it's Berlin, and the mug on it says Der Pharisäer, which is the German word for the Pharisee.
Okay.
And it's a coffee that is half rum and half coffee. And it looks like you're drinking coffee in the morning, but you're actually drinking rum. And so it's the German stereotype for a Pharisee as a hypocrite who looks like they're drinking coffee, but inside they're full of rum.
Welcome to TheoDisc. I'm your host, Kenny Innes. Now, at first glance, the Pharisees appeared to be the boogeymen of the Gospels, a group of legalists who irritated and burdened the Jewish populace with unnecessary religious laws and tried to sabotage Jesus' ministry because his gracious and lenient approach was more popular. But what if we have gotten the Pharisees, and consequently Jesus' relationship with them, wrong? My guest on this episode, Scot McKnight, says that's exactly what's happened, and an understanding of first century Jewish tradition and culture contradicts much of what Christians have taught and believed about the Pharisees, and also shielded us from how Jesus might critique our own traditions. Scot McKnight is a New Testament scholar, historian of early Christianity, a theologian, and author who has written widely on the historical Jesus, early Christianity, and Christian living. His books include The Jesus Creed, Kingdom Conspiracy, his translation of the New Testament called The Second Testament, and recently his book with Tommy Preston Phillips entitled Invisible Jesus, looking at the challenge of deconstruction. Excitingly, Scot will be teaching with WTC from September 2025 on our MA program with a module entitled Jesus of Nazareth. This was an enlightening conversation, and hopefully you're as challenged as I am on Jesus' connection with the Pharisees and how he wants us to challenge our own traditions so we remain faithful citizens of the kingdom of God. Well, Scot McKnight, welcome back to the TheoDisc podcast. It's great to have you again.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So we are going to talk in this episode about Jesus and the Pharisees. But before we get into the meat of that, you've been on the podcast before, so I don't have to ask you the three questions that every first-time guest does. But it would be good to find out, what's a book that you're reading at the moment that's kind of catching your attention?
Well, this is what I do for a life. I'm always reading. And I'm reading right now Christoph Heilig's book, Paul the Storyteller. And it's an academic book, but I find it very stimulating. And I'm also reading in the evenings a new book by a Lithuanian author whose last name I cannot pronounce. It's called Disgraced. It's about the scandals connected to megachurch pastors in the history of Protestantism in the United States.
Okay.
So that's the kind of stuff I'm reading right now. So
the history, which is still ongoing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's ongoing, yes.
And what are you writing about at the moment?
Well, I have finished my project of the 16 volumes on the Everyday Bible Study, which was been the last 4 years. And it was just really spiritually satisfying to do those books. And but I'm right now working on 3 writing projects, okay? So, and I don't like to have 3. I don't mind 2, but one of them is on trauma with a trauma therapist. I explore Paul as a traumatized apostle. All right, 2 Corinthians 10-13. And Adrian Gibson, my co-author, is shadowing me and ahead of me and next to me, making sure everything stays true to trauma, but also she brings it into the modern world about trauma and how churches and Christian organizations can be more trauma sensitive and informed. So that's one project. I'm writing a larger project on Jesus and the Pharisees. I've been working on it for 2 or 3 years, teaching about it, and it's becoming a book about the public life of Jesus and how the Pharisees fit into that.
Mm.
And I'm working, and this morning I've been working on a book I'm writing with Dr. Lucy Pepiot on Jesus and women. So
Ah,
I'm starting a chapter on motherhood right now in the Jewish world in Jesus.
that's a scoop. I didn't even know that was going on. So amazing. That's brilliant. Exciting to
Yeah.
hear.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and I guess that ties into another thing that's exciting is that you're going to be coming to WTC this September to teach on our MA program.
That's correct, and I'm looking forward to this, Kenny. I figured that WTC taught all its courses in Bristol, and we had been to Bristol, and it's not far from Bath.
Mm-hmm.
Bath is what we call it. All right.
Yeah.
And I thought that's fine. And then Lucy, I think it was Lucy, maybe it was Ben, who informed me, oh no, the course is taught in Nottingham.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I did my PhD. So I thought,
Yeah.
well, this is really fun. I've come back home, as it were. It's a full
Yeah.
circle. And we're really looking forward to being in Nottingham. I don't really know. There's a new facility and everything where
Yeah.
this is all done. So I don't know anything about that. But we lived there for a year when I was doing my PhD. The second year, we moved down to Cambridge, where I worked at Tyndale House. But Jimmy Dunn was my professor at
Mm-hmm.
Nottingham, and he then moved to Durham. So I would take the train from Cambridge to Nottingham and meet with Jimmy in his living room, maybe every other month or something like that. And that was my supervision for my PhD time. So we're looking forward to coming, and I get to teach about Jesus, and of course, I'll be talking about Jesus and the Pharisees as well.
So let's dig into that then. So obviously you're writing a book on it. It's part of the module that you're going to be teaching. You've taught on it before. What's the deal with Jesus and the Pharisees? Why is that so intriguing to you?
Well, when I was a student at Nottingham, I read in preparation for a chapter the background I was doing. I was working on Jewish missionary activity. I read E.P. Sanders' book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which was a stunning book at the time. And so I've participated in what Jimmy Dunn then developed as the new perspective that was also worked on by Tom Wright. So I've been very concerned with how Christians talk about Judaism and pose Christianity, the Apostle Paul, the Christian theology of grace, over against Judaism's understanding of grace and its beliefs for a long time. So this has been 40 some years that I've been concerned about this topic. But a few years ago, Joseph Sievers and Amy Jill Levine edited a book called The Pharisees. Let's see, how do I do this? The Pharisees.
Yep.
Okay. And this was a big event at the Vatican, I believe. And this book was published in 2021. And the book was stunning to me, Kenny. And as I was reading it, I thought, I need to spend my time thinking about how to frame the Pharisees in the Gospels, especially with Jesus. And so I kind of plotted that I would teach a course on the Pharisees, or at least start talking about the Pharisees more. And then I decided I wanted to write a book about the Pharisees and Jesus. And as I've been working on that book and teaching about the Pharisees the last few years, I decided that the book had to be sort of the life of Jesus, the public life of Jesus, and how the Pharisees fit into that larger strategy. And I'm getting there. I've worked out the details in most cases, but I worked it out linearly, so every topic is worked out as sort of like a chapter, and I've written that up. But now I'm putting it together into the life of Jesus in a more let's say, novel-like fashion, more of instead of now we're going to talk about the crowds and now we're going to talk about Jesus and the law. It's just all intermingled because I think that's the only way to experience the reality of how the Pharisees actually emerged in the life of Jesus.
Well, in her chapter in the book, Amy kind of highlights the problem amongst Christians and our perspective of the Pharisees as it's been taught for a long time. And she says this: preaching and teaching throughout the Christian world continued to depict Pharisees as xenophobic, self-righteous, elitist, legalistic, money-loving, judgmental, unseeing hypocrites. Now, for those of us who've been in kind of evangelical Western churches, we might say, yeah, that's exactly who the Pharisees are because that's how it has been taught. So what's the problem with that perspective as you see it?
Well, yes, and the word, I've traced this in many places. Now I don't even know if people know that I say it because I teach it all the time. Is Pharisee is a pejorative slur in the Christian world. I mean, and this is not just evangelicals.
Sure.
I hear this as much from mainliners as I hear it from evangelicals in the United States. Pharisee is a slur. Here's something that needs to be faced. Jews, let's say observant Jews, that is those who follow the law and follow the halakhic interpretations of the law. Let's say they don't eat pork today and bacon, shrimp. They look at Pharisee as a positive term. So what I teach my classes, I don't know if this will work in England, but it works in the United States, especially because I'm teaching in Texas, is if you change the word Pharisee to Baptist, you are going to experience the way Pharisees in the first century experienced the words of Jesus. And the first thing you're going to say is, woo, that's an exaggeration. That's hyperbolic. Really, Jesus, do you think that this is the case with all Pharisees? And I think that is where we have to start, is that there's a hyperbole, there's an exaggerated nature to the rhetoric. Now, the side, let's say, the long-term impact of the way Christians have talked about Pharisees and Jews, in which for most it has become all Jews are Pharisees, all Jews are Christ killers, all Jews are guilty of all these bad things, and we need to get rid of these Pharisees. The long-term impact of the way Christians have talked about the Pharisees because of the rhetoric of Jesus has been destructive and ultimately led, in part at least, to the Holocaust. And so we need to recognize what this rhetoric does and has done over time. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's a beginning. I think that we need to recognize that it's heated rhetoric, and it is stereotypical, and it is exaggerated, and it's hyperbolic, and it is dangerous.
And we even use it among ourselves when we're talking about someone being legalistic. Okay, so you say you're such a or you're being pharisaical, and again, I guess that ties into a perception that Hebrew or Jewish thought was all about that we earn our salvation through works, which in itself is kind of a stereotype.
Do you know who Michael Reeves is?
I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's an Englishman who has written a book on evangelical Pharisees. And it's a sort of a reformed type little book that's pastorally shaped to keep evangelicals from being legalistic and pharisaical about their understanding of Christianity. And I just think he plays into every stereotype, and he dismisses rather casually, because his audience has already dismissed casually, the new perspective on Paul and the new perspective of Judaism, which is what the new perspective on Paul starts with. Um, but Pharisees have become a stereotype of legalism, and of legalism that is hypocritical. So there is a drink that was at one time available in, I think it's Berlin. I'm pretty sure it's Berlin. It's a morning coffee, and the mug on it says Der Pharisäer, which is the German word for the Pharisee. Okay. And it's a coffee that is half rum and half coffee. And it looks like you're drinking coffee in the morning, but you're actually drinking rum. And so it's the German stereotype for a Pharisee as a hypocrite who looks like they're drinking coffee, but inside they're full of rum.
Right.
So this is the standard understanding, and there's so many distortions involved in this. I know this conversation can go in so many directions, but let me put it this. Jews were no more inclined toward what we call legalism or hypocrisy any more than Christians are. All religious groups evaluate, let's say religious zealots, evaluate other people on the basis of their own standards. And there is nothing about Judaism's observance of the law and development of its laws that is not paralleled in Christianity.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. So now we're bringing it home already that there's some things that we have to face ourselves. And we'll get into that a little bit. But first, let's get a definition of who the Pharisees were, what their aims were, because I think that'd be really helpful to start unpicking the stereotype that we have.
Okay. When I translated the New Testament, it's called the Second Testament. I think I talked to you about this translation.
Yeah, we did. We talked about it, yeah.
I translated the word Pharisee with the word observant. The observant, that is the observant ones. A Pharisee was a person who followed the law of Moses as interpreted in a tradition of interpretation that we will now call the Pharisaic tradition.
Okay.
And it had certain characteristics, but they were a group of people who followed an interpretive tradition of how best to follow the law. Now, here's something that's important. Moses says you can't work on the Sabbath, which is a great rule, a law, until you figure out, does this constitute work? All right. Can I carry a pot from my house to my neighbor's? Is that work? Can I, in walking through a field of grain, grab the head of wheat and rub the grain and eat the little seeds in it? Is that harvesting? Okay.
Right.
Everybody recognizes that laws don't work simply on their own, that they have a legal developmental tradition alongside them to make sure things are clear. By the time of the New Testament, there was a list, roughly the time of the New Testament, it's in the rabbinic writing, of 40 things that constituted work in the Pharisaic or the rabbinic tradition. Now, Pharisees and rabbis aren't the same thing. All right. Okay. I grew up with a father who, for a few years, was a committed Sabbatarian. Okay.
Yep.
Which meant the day had to be holy. Which meant for my father at that time, and for my sisters, one younger, one older, I couldn't play sports outside on the Sabbath.
Right.
Which was totally boring for me to sit in the house all day. At least I didn't have to wear my coat and tie all afternoon, right. Which I did at times because we would go out to eat with friends at church. And My father considered playing sports outdoors on a Sunday a violation of the Sabbath. Now, he believed in the Sabbath because of the law of Moses, but this was an interpretive tradition that I was expected to follow. I followed it only because I was young enough to be controllable by my father. Okay.
Okay.
Fortunately,
Yeah.
within about 2 years or a year, I don't know how long it lasted, he gave up on that. And I even played golf on Sunday afternoon at times. After we had lunch, I would go to the golf course. All right. That's what a Pharisee is. A Pharisee is someone who is marked by an interpretive tradition. And
Right.
okay, now let's just be really clear. The Episcopalians have one of these. The Church of England has one of these. The Baptists have these. The Charismatics have these. The Vineyard has these. The Methodists have these. The Wesleyans have. Everybody's got a tradition. So in a sense, it is easy to find analogies to Pharisees in all the Christian traditions when you define it as someone who is observant of a tradition. Now, let me say a little bit more. I don't know if you're going to go with another question, but let me add this.
No, go for it. Keep going.
Okay. A Pharisee, I'll make a couple major points. The Pharisees were politically cautious. They were shrewd. They did not have the power of Jerusalem. They were not the high priests. They were not, at the time of Jesus, in the family of Annas or Caiaphas. They were not the Sadducees, who were priests. They were not priests. They were not, in that sense, ordained. We don't, of course, that's not a silly term, but they were not officially a part of the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
But they also had, this is fundamentally important for the Pharisees, they had a way with the crowds. The people of the land of Israel at the time of Jesus in Judea and Galilee liked the Pharisees. The crowds liked them. Martin Goodman, a great scholar at Oxford University, has made the point that the priesthood, that inner circle of power in Jerusalem, did not have the favor of the crowds.
Right.
So the Pharisees became politically astute at mediating between the priesthood and the people, the crowds. Now, the priests had to mediate between Rome, which would be Pilate in Caesarea Maritima, and Antipas in Tiberias, and Philip in the region east of the Sea of Galilee. The priests had to mediate that between Rome and, let's say, the Jewish populace. And the Pharisees became, in many ways, their mediators. Okay, so they were politically involved, but they did not have political power.
Okay.
So they couldn't go to Jerusalem and say, "This is what we're going to do." They had to get authorized. It is noticeable that when the Apostle Paul goes to Damascus to breathe out his fiery threats against these early Christians, that he needed a letter from the high priest. Because he did not have, as a Pharisee, he calls himself a Pharisee, and he continued to call himself a Pharisee as a Christian in Acts 23 and 26. I am a Pharisee, he says, not I was. All right, so Paul needed the authorization of the priesthood to be able to pull off what he wanted to pull off as a Pharisee. So the Pharisees are politically cautious and politically shrewd, and I think they were good. They were socially skilled people. That's the way I would put them. And they were popular. You can't be a stick in the mud. Is that English?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's very English? Okay. Okay, that's a rather odd expression in the United States. You can't be a stick in the mud and be popular. So we have to recognize that they were pleasing to the ordinary Jew. This is in part why Jesus comes into conflict with them, is because he's pleasing the same group of people. the crowds like Jesus too. So there's tension, conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees over the crowds because both of them appealed very effectively to ordinary people. So we've got to get rid of the idea that the Pharisees were mean-spirited, bigoted, harsh Puritans like Jonathan Edwards or David Brainerd or somebody in the United States, or Nathaniel Hawthorne's Dimsdale. This is that's an American novel. I hope the British read Nathaniel Hawthorne. But this is not the way the Pharisees were. They were not mean people. They were not tough-minded in that sense. They were observant. And now here's the one that really kind of stuns my students and audiences where I talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were first century progressives.
That's the mind blower.
It is a mind blower. Now here's, in the United States, okay, this really works in the United States, but in a sense it backfires. So I'll use the backfire.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, there is a slur that American evangelicals especially use, conservatives use. They call them activist judges. Mm-hmm. An activist judge is a judge that conservatives don't like because they're progressive. They're making additions to the law rather than going back to the intent of the framers of the Constitution. Okay,
mm-hmm.
So they look at these judges as making up new laws, and we need to get rid of them. And we've got a president right now who's trying to do this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. All right. But the Pharisees were skilled interpreters of the law in the direction of helping ordinary Jews follow the law in a way that was doable and practicable. Here's an example. All right. Let's say that Reuben and Rebecca live in a set of houses. Now I can't remember the term used. When houses are built together, what do you call them?
Like tenements or?
Yeah, tenements, but more, let's say row houses.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right,
yep.
So the walls are the same, so it's a building of, let's say, 6 houses. And Reuben and Rebecca live at one end of these row houses, and at the other end is Shmuley and Sarah. Okay. They decide that on Shabbat, Sabbath, they want to eat together. There's 2 ways to do this. One Shabbat, Reuben and Rebecca cook everything and the others walk down. The other way is that they can share pots. Now, how can they carry food from one end of the row house to the other without it constituting work? Well, the interpreters of the law went to work on this. And when they built these houses, they could build a stone or a stick that covered the wall between the two. So in other words, it's on the top of it and it extends into both houses. And this means that every house is actually the same house because they're all connected by these sticks.
Right.
If the A building actually has part of a stick in the B building, then they're the same building. And you can carry it. You can always carry a pot. This is Pharisaic, and this, I don't know how often this occurred, but it did occur. This is Pharisaic activist judges interpreting the Torah in a way that makes the law doable and practicable. And when you start adding laws, you are not adding laws to make the law more burdensome, even if some people think it's burdensome. You are adding laws in order to make the laws more doable. So my father added, he wanted me to be Sabbath observant. So he said, no playing of sports outside on the Sabbath. So I sat in my bedroom and drew on laundry cards. These were stuffed inside of my dad's shirts.
Hmm.
after he had the ironing done, or had the laundry done at the local laundromat, or not laundromat, the dry cleaners.
Hmm.
And so these were really nice cards, and I drew old-fashioned cars. That I don't know where I got these things, but I enjoyed doing this. And I remember being bored, but there was nothing else to do, so that's what I did. Okay, we didn't have 24/7 sports at that time, or I would have been watching TV if my dad would have permitted me. All right, he was trying to make the law doable for me. He was not imposing. He was not imposing some impracticable or undoable set of laws on me. Pharisees were activist judges, but they were activists in a progressive sense, a liberalizing sense, making it more doable for ordinary people. All right, now the Essenes at Qumran called the Pharisees seekers of smooth things. Now, this is an expression for Jews at that time that meant someone who was a compromiser of the law of Moses. So they were strict. They perceived the Pharisees as liberals, as progressives, as loose. So they interpreted laws that made the law more doable for the ordinary person. All right, now here's another one. Let's say you are walking from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem for a major festival in Jerusalem, and you're in a caravan of, let's say, 50 people. Well, what happens if it is discovered that one person in that group stepped on a dead rodent? They're unclean or
Hmm.
somehow contracted impurity. All right, and there's many ways that you can contract impurity. And that person has touched and mixed with people all day long. Now, almost everybody's impure. All right, can they celebrate the festival? Well, there was a rule that was developed that if in a caravan, if in a group, if in a family, one person was pure, the whole family was pure for the sake of the festival. All right, that's making the law doable. But yes, it's an addition of a law. But that's how laws are. All laws develop over time. All right. And even within the Old Testament, Passover laws developed. All right. There's one
Hmm.
Passover law that says you can't boil a lamb. And Deuteronomy says you can boil lamb.
Right.
So there's development within the pages of the Old Testament. And there's development on Sabbath laws. As you study Sabbath in the pages of the Old Testament, you begin to see that they're beginning to increase the laws connected to what constitutes work. So that we would call that progressivism.
So if Jesus is coming at them so hard and he's using, I mean, let's be honest, he uses really harsh language at points about them. Is he kind of going after this liberalism then? And what does that make Jesus?
Okay. First of all, I think the language that Jesus uses is all too typical of that world.
Hmm.
So the way you deal with an opponent is to give them a name. All right. And Jesus calls them hypocrites.
Hmm.
And this is how you dealt with opponents. You labeled them. Politicians do this all the time. You know, we
Hmm.
do it. It's constant. I don't like it. It's labeling, but it's the way it works. All right. So Jesus's interpretation, his interpretation of the law is not theirs. And yet, you can't simply say that Jesus wants to get back to Moses. On divorce, the Pharisees developed laws that made it practicable and relatively easy to divorce. A man could divorce his wife for a variety of reasons as long
Hmm.
as he gave her a bill of divorce, which gave her the opportunity to remarry. Okay? Jesus is, if you want to use the expression, a stick in the mud about this one. He thinks that people should not be divorcing and they should not be remarrying. That's what it looks like in Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew 19 and parallels in Mark 10 and Luke's gospel. So Jesus on this one in Matthew 19 simply goes back to the law of Moses and says Moses gave that permission to divorce because of the hardness of your heart. And now that the kingdom of God has come, evidently the hardness of your heart is going to be softened. So now you won't need that permission. So now, no divorces. That looks to me like Jesus is not only going back to the Old Testament, but pushing back through Deuteronomy chapter 19, isn't it? 19 into the creation account that God made man and woman in marriage, one. So Jesus looks like he's a conservative there. But when it comes to rubbing grain, which the Pharisees said, harvesting grain on Shabbat is unobservant and contrary to the law of Moses, Jesus says, well, the Sabbath rules were made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So therefore, my disciples are okay eating or harvesting grain on the Sabbath. So it's not simply that Jesus is a biblicist and they are progressive judges. It's that Jesus is sometimes more conservative, like the Essenes, and other times more progressive. So Jesus doesn't line up with any of our categories so that we can label him.
Man.
His interpretations are different than theirs, and that was the conflict. He conflicted with them over certain things. Are there certain principles? Yes. I think one of the major principles Jesus used in arguing with the Pharisees was, let's say, which of the commands is the weightiest? So he discerned that justice and mercy and faithfulness were more important, say, than straining out a gnat from a glass of wine on the basis of using cheesecloth so that you can strain out the things that cause contamination and impurity.
Yeah.
How have I done, Kenny?
No, that's great. It's great. And I was thinking earlier about even when we were talking a little bit about Paul saying that he still claims himself as a Pharisee. So much of what Paul is doing in his letter seems to be kind of interpreting the law of grace in Christ for how the church is supposed to live that out. And I thought that's kind of an interesting thing.
Paul's use of the Old Testament is a very Pharisaic thing to do. He's playing he's interpreting the Torah and the prophets in a way that the Pharisees would have recognized as he's pretty good at this. He's done his work. We disagree. But his fundamental basis is that Jesus is the Messiah, and therefore he reads the Old Testament through that grid, that hermeneutic, and that's where they actually disagreed. But once they could say, okay, let's assume that Jesus is the Messiah, Paul's interpretations are completely kosher, to use a Jewish expression.
Yeah. Okay, so we've made the point that we can't posture ourselves anymore as kind of the opposite of the Pharisees. They're legalistic. We have some of the same issues. So what is Jesus saying to us now? If he was going to confront us in our time, in our kind of church cultures, how would we find ourselves on the end of some of that confrontation, particularly as it seems like we can't label him as on our conservative side or on our liberal side, however we might define our own theology?
I think we would be surprised at how pointed Jesus could be about and insightful about places that we expose ourselves as not following the true will of God. All right? He would say that you are really good at articulating your evangelical theology, and you've written your books, and you've got your creedal statements. But in your creedal statements, I don't see anything about loving God and loving others as you love yourself, and practicing that in such a way that you witness to the power of God and the gospel in our world today. I think he would say, right now, you people are really obsessed with whether lesbians and gays are following the will of God, but your ministers are divorced and remarried, and you don't have any rules about this anymore, even though I made my teachings really clear in Matthew 5 And you love to say you follow the Sermon on the Mount, but you don't.
Mm.
So I think Jesus would be surprisingly insightful, and in some ways, it should be very unpredictable what he would see. I think he'd have problems with mega churches. I think he would definitely have problems with the exaltation and celebrity making of pastors, and how much money they make, and how they live, and how they exercise power in their churches.
Mm. Yeah. And what about kind of the progressive side that would say, great, so we're not the stick in the muds. Jesus is with us, kind of going to the poor, helping people. What might he say to them?
Well, I think Jesus would say, "You're doing really well. I really
Mm.
like your concern for the poor and for the immigrant and for the marginalized and the neglected." Um, I think, okay, now there's stereotypes of mainlines in the United States. I mean, here's a
Yeah.
fact: most mainline congregants are more or less evangelical.
Mm.
The leadership tends to be the progressive side. And I think he would say, are you preaching the centrality of me, of Christ? Are you preaching redemption in Christ? Are you preaching forgiveness of sins? And at the same time, calling people to discipleship. I just read a book by Fleming Rutledge that she gave
Mm-hmm.
lectures at uh, Truett Seminary, which is Baylor's seminary,
Mm-hmm.
Texas Baptist, called By the Word Worked.
Mm.
And in it, she kind of rails against mainliners because they preach the Gospels and not Paul. Now that's going to be my hyperbolic description of what she's doing, but she's critical
Sure.
of them preaching do, do, do.
Right.
And I think to myself, well, when I read the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of do, do, do there for me. So what do we do? And I take it that she's pushing that in the main line, there's too much do, do, do and not enough grace. And so she's pushing for, I guess, the Pauline vision of apocalyptic Pauline theology, which is what she's
Mm.
doing. And I think that she mistakenly presses against something that needs to be found more in evangelicalism. The Sermon on the Mount, discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship or Discipleship. I think that's what is a message that needs to be heard in the church today in American evangelicalism. It's easy grace. And
Mm.
so there's always this tension in the Bible between the grace of God that transforms, the love of God, and the expectation and demand of God for those who have embraced this grace to become grace giving agents whose lives are transformed into Christ likeness. I mean, Paul does a lot of do, do, do himself.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that those issues translate over here as well, and I guess Jesus is such that none of our traditions are exempt from his confrontation to correct and pull us back into the heart of what God is trying to do in our lives. I guess a final question might be, if you're someone who may be listening to this who's been on the end of kind of religious structures or traditions that have been harmful for them or hurtful. And I don't just position that as kind of legalistic. I think there's lots of ways that our church structures or religious structures can lead people into a place where they're kind of feeling hurt or not sure who to trust or how to trust God. What would Jesus say to them?
I think he would say what he told his own disciples who were experiencing, let's see, the rough side of, let's say, some traditions, when he
Mm.
said, "Come to me, all the laboring and loaded," that's my translation in Matthew 11:28, "and I will provide rest for you."
Mm.
I mean, the direct verb is, I will rest you. I
You.
will give
Wow.
you rest. Lift my yoke upon you, he says, and be apprenticed by me. because I am meek and impoverished in heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is gracious and my load is light. So I think Jesus would call them to himself and find the rest that they need in him, and in the sense drop the other loads, the other yokes, and find his yoke, and you will find that his yoke is going to lead us in the right direction.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Scott. I think those who are listening will come away from this conversation with, at the very least, the need to go and investigate all of these passages with the Pharisees and rethink the way that we have heard it, and for many of us taught it. I think the initial thing about that we don't understand that word can actually be heard as a anti-Semitic slur is really important for those who are teaching regularly in their churches and to be aware of that. And for, I think, the most important thing, to see Jesus as he really is, not as the one who comes to take our own sides in our traditions or in our political positions, but as the one who's constantly challenging us all to live out the kingdom of God. So thank you for spending the time. Really looking forward to having you over in September.
Yes, we're looking forward to coming. Thank you, Kenny.
So if you are interested in studying an MA, this is the kind of stuff that you may get from Scott if you come and study with WTC this year. But have a great rest of the day, Scott. It's good to have you with us, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you. It's snowing here right now, Kenny.
Oh.